When the Second World War began on 1 September 1939, over 70 countries found themselves browbeaten to participate and to contribute to the war effort. The war impacted every aspect of human life in ways that are still prevalent today. But what do we know about its impact on the economics of labor, migration issues, and human settlement? In particular, what do we know about the war's impact on the populations of defeated countries? In this special episode of the book series, I called a professor of history at Louisiana State University. A new book, From Incarceration to Repatriation, German Prisoners of War in the Soviet Union, was published by Cornell University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link in the description panel of this video. This book is covered as part of the International History series. Enjoy the show. Dr. Susan Grunewald, thank you so much for making the time and welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me here.
That's wonderful. I am very excited to have you. I'm a military historian myself. I very much love military history. I'm doing a dissertation on military history, and like I told you, I just recently published an article on the very same issues that you are also looking at. I did an article on the mobilization and recruitment of African soldiers who participated in the Second World War. I have quite several other accounts about wartime experiences, demobilization. So this is a history that I personally am very interested in. I know we have other people who like military history a lot in the outside world. Our international audience will love it, but on a personal level, I really appreciate the work that you do. It's also something that I have vested interest in. So I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion. So before we talk about the book particularly, I just want you to talk a bit briefly about yourself so that our audience can get to know you and get to know the work that you are doing. I understand at the moment you are working as an assistant professor at Louisiana State University. I was in Louisiana, by the way, in 2022. I was staying at the World War II Museum.
Okay, yeah.
I was staying right opposite. I was staying at the Higgins Hotel, which is right opposite to the National World War II Museum. I had lots of fun. It was a pretty nice experience. But tell me more about yourself. Who is Dr. Susan Grunewald, and what are you working on?
I'm a historian of the Soviet Union and modern Germany, a military historian, historian of the Eastern Front, historian of history of memory, and digital humanities. So those are my biggest research interests. I went to Carnegie Mellon for my PhD, where obviously I was trained in Soviet history, German history, and very heavily in digital humanities. And then I had a wonderful postdoc for 3 years at the University of Pittsburgh in the World History Center as the digital history postdoctoral fellow before I wound up at LSU. That's me as an academic in a nutshell. I'm also outside of academics. I am obsessed with cars. So I love old cars, antique motorcycles. I actually have it's Russian made. It's a Ural, so it's really a 1930s BMW. The technology was given to the Soviets as part of the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and it has been continuously produced by the Soviets and then the Russians. So I have my own piece of World War II motoring history in my garage.
Nice. That's pretty good. So I understand you're currently teaching classes, undergraduate classes, and perhaps probably graduate classes. What classes are you teaching at the moment, and what are the core contents of those classes?
Sure. So I teach Western civilization every year. So largely Europe and the world, roughly Reformation to present. I teach a survey course in the history of World War II, which I make a global history of World War II. I teach Russian history, 1861 to present, German history, basically unification to present. I've taught the Modern European History Graduate Studies seminar, and I have taught a graduate level seminar in digital humanities and digital historical methods. The surveys, I think, are pretty self-evident what they
Hmm.
cover, right? So if I'm teaching a survey course, be it World War II, be it Soviet history, for example, I try to teach the major events, but I describe it as broad but shallow coverage with deep dives. So I try to
Hmm.
get through all of the major events, some of the key players, but then I try to bring in aspects of things that are understudied, right? So if we're talking about the history of the Second World War, as a historian of the Eastern Front, I obviously emphasize that history, which is understudied in the US context, but I also really make it a global history and try to explain how the major fronts of the war are happening in conversation with each other.
Hmm.
Right, things
Hmm.
that are happening on the Eastern Front in Europe rely heavily upon what's also happening at the same time in the Western Front in the later stages of the war, and they also coincide with what is happening in the Pacific. Right, where can various combatants, um, where can they deploy their forces or not? What
Hmm.
is the chess that's going on with the tacticians? But also, I mean, the Second World War is deeply a civilian experience, so I
Yes.
get into the social and cultural history of that as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would like to sign up for the classes that are taught by Dr. Susan, please be sure to check them out. I'll put the details right in the description panel on the upload for this video. So now let's talk about this book, From Incarceration to Repatriation. You tell us in this book that about 1.5 million German prisoners of war were kept in the Soviet Union during the Second World War and after the Second World War, up for a period about 7 years up until 1956. I'm sure this is the time of Joseph Stalin.
Mhm.
Um, and, you tell us a very interesting story that they were used to cover up for labor and all that. It's a very interesting account. But I would want to give you an opportunity to break down what you consider to be the core ideas of the book and its central argument.
Sure. So as you stated, right, my large research concern, my main concern going into this project was, okay, there were at surrender, there were 3 million German soldiers. And that's Germans. I'm not counting necessarily Austrians, Hungarians, Italians, anybody who fought in the Axis forces. This is specifically Germans. So in May of 1945, there are 3 million of them. By December of 1945, there are 1.5 million. So 1.5 million either were returned home quickly or died in captivity in that time frame. And the remaining 1.5 million men were held, they were released in waves, and the last of them, the last few thousand, returned home in 1956, right? So 11 years after the end of the war. Why were so many men held for so long? And I had a suspicion that it was due to the economics of the Second World War. The Soviet Union is technically a victor nation, right? They are one of the winning allied powers. But in reality, they came out of the war almost as a defeated power in terms of the number of civilians and soldiers who were killed in the war and the massive physical destruction of the Soviet Union. So recent, somewhat more conservative estimates place Soviet death totals at 27 million. So that's much higher than the other major combatant nations, with the exception of China.
Mhm.
And they lost about a quarter of their total physical assets. Thousands of miles of roads and railroads were destroyed. Both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht practiced scorched earth techniques when retreating. So mines were destroyed, villages, cities, everything was in rubble and ruin.
Mhm.
So, my research basically argues that the Soviet authorities chose to detain any able-bodied, the emphasis is on able-bodied,
Mhm.
German prisoners of war
Mhm.
because they were in such a labor shortage and they needed each and every additional man they could get to
Yes.
contribute to post-war reconstruction. And
Mhm.
so, as soon as the war is over, the Soviet authorities started to release anybody who was ill or injured, and they held on to the ones who could be deployed for labor.
Mhm.
and they
Wow.
were held on to until they were ill or injured. And basically they're held for labor reconstruction needs until 1949. Around 1949, the number of prisoners had dwindled enough that the remaining few are really held seemingly under, I don't have a document to prove this, but based on the scattered evidence from Russian archives,
Okay.
seemingly at Stalin's behest, and they are used more so as bargaining chips in the burgeoning Cold War.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very, your account is very comprehensive and detailed. And I always wondered that how did you come out with this idea? And as well, what were your sources
Sure.
for this particular material? Yeah.
So the origin of the project and some of this kind of conceptualization about it had to do with what I did for a year after college.
Hmm.
So I had a Fulbright English teaching assistant position in Ulyanovsk, Russia, which is Lenin's hometown.
Oh,
It's
nice. Nice.
provincial Russia. It's in European Russia. It's on the Volga River. It was a city that did not see fighting during World War II.
Hmm.
And Russia has very strict migration control. So when I was at the university, I had to hand in my passport and my documents to register where I was. And the university building for that was on Karl Marx Street. And I walked in and somebody there said something about, "Do you like our building?" And I figured like it's a building, it's great, it's fine. And they said, "No, no, you don't understand. This building was built by German prisoners of war. This building, it was built by Germans. It's of higher quality than the other Soviet buildings." And so I wanted to know what Germans were doing in a city far away from the front lines and so on and so forth. And that led me down this project where I discovered there wasn't really anything written about these men in English, at least during their wartime captivity. There have been a smattering of works that have come out looking at them more so after they've been repatriated, and either they're memories from memoirs or their attempts to be reintegrated into either West or East Germany. And there have been really few works. A lot has been written in German on this topic, unsurprisingly, but there have been very few works that have used former Soviet archives to delve into this. So miraculously, I was there before COVID. I was there before, obviously, Russia became a place you couldn't travel to due to the current conflict. I was not prevented from accessing most sources I requested in the Russian State Military Archive. I also worked in the State Archive of the Russian Federation and the Socio-Political Archive of the Russian Federation and got a variety of documents. One of the issues with my project is that despite the fact that the Soviet Union was a centrally planned economy, there is
Hmm.
not a central accounting of prisoner of war labor statistics that is at least
Hmm.
declassified.
Okay,
I
I see.
assume they exist. They're just not in archives that civilians and foreigners
Oh,
could
yes,
access.
yes, yes.
So the military archive had all of this, had central records, some central records for the, it was originally the NKVD in 1946. It's renamed the MVD. So the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs and then the Ministry of Internal Affairs.
Hmm.
Their documents were there, and then there were individual files for major camps.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there were thousands, literally thousands and thousands of camps and sub-branch camps that operated between 1941 and 1956 for the prisoners of war.
Hmm.
So there are records, but they're not centralized accountings. So that's
Hmm.
why I also turned to digital humanities methods to try to answer this economics question.
Hmm.
So there was a joint German-Russian team that went into the state military archive around 2010 and produced an encyclopedia of camps. So I digitized that encyclopedia. I worked with a programmer to look up coordinates for those thousands and thousands of camps, and then I mapped them so I could
Hmm.
just get a geographic spread of where the camps were to answer certain questions about is it really post-war reconstruction or is it punishment for punishment's sake?
Oh,
And the
yes.
vast majority of the camps are located in the areas that saw the fiercest fighting and destruction, or were located in key hubs for the Soviet economy, right? So in the Urals mountain range, for example, which was a site of the steel industry, and steel is a key industry for post-war reconstruction.
Hmm.
Likewise, coal industry. I was able to take data for coal basins in the Soviet Union and overlay the camps over that. So there's a correlation there between the camps and coal mining, for example.
Hmm.
I could also use temperature data, again, to look into is it punishment for punishment's sake, or is their economic utility. The camps where the Germans were, if you're a German, the majority of Russia is going to feel cold and hostile and tough to live through. But
Mm-hmm.
the Germans were actually in some of the more temperate regions of Russia. They were not in any of the permafrost regions. They were not in the extreme, extreme far north, the really desolate locations where the other infamous camp system, the Gulag,
Mm-hmm.
these German prisoner of war camps actually took a lot of the Soviet Union created the Gulag in the basically in the late 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
NKVD operated the Gulag. When the prisoner of war camps were first created in 1939, coinciding with the Winter War and invasion of Poland, um, men who had run the Gulag were then tasked with running these camps. So all the things that the NKVD discovered for how to house, how to feed, how to mobilize forced labor like that was transferred over to the POWs. The Gulag was in some really inhospitable parts of the Soviet Union as ways to domestically colonize the Soviet Union. There were places where there were key resources that free labor did not want to go to. So Soviet authorities used prison labor to do that, for example, to extract coal or gold and so on and so forth. The German prisoner of war camps were not in the worst regions, the most notorious regions for some of those Gulag camps, for example. So there's a difference. Um, so that's how I use digital mapping to also help me answer the question of economics and sort of to triangulate to make my argument. You know, if I have scattered documents here and there from Stalin himself, deploying thousands of prisoners to a particular coal mine, to a particular factory, to a particular city for reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
But one or two documents don't tell the whole story, and so I've used those documents, plus the central documents or the camp documents, the mapping, and also information from memoirs of the prisoners themselves to tell the story of post-war reconstruction and labor.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. I my next question for you, I have to contextualize it because I want to explain to you why I found this work interesting, particularly for the series on international history studies. When the Second World War began in September 1939,
Mhm,
much of Africa was under colonial rule. And from where I'm from, colonial Zimbabwe, it was then a British colony. And as a result, a lot of Africans were mobilized forcibly and recruited to go and participate in the war. And at the very same time, Britain, the then colonizer, set up flying schools in the colony to train the fighter pilots, the bomb aimers, the engineers that were then dispatched to go and fight after just
mhm,
taking a 6 month, 7 months course and all that. And at the very same time, they set up internment camps in which German prisoners of war and Polish refugees were kept. So we
mhm,
had quite a lot of them who stayed in different areas of the country. Some of them even escaped out of those camps and began to live life with colonial subjects and with other Rhodesians during that particular time. So we have a very it's something that we can relate with,
yeah.
even when we are from very different geographical regions. It's something that we can relate it on an international history kind of basis. So that's the history and that's the context behind it for the case of colonial Zimbabwe. So looking at your study, what is the history behind all this? What got these millions of Germans in Russia during and after the Second World
Well, so there are a handful of things going on, right?
War?
As you
Hmm.
mentioned, internment camps, prisoner of war camps, they're not unique to the Soviet Union. They're not unique to, for example, the Axis powers. A lot of this actually, and I talk about this in my book too, there's a lot of precedent for this that comes from the First World War. Right, so during World War One, and again, I emphasize more so the German-Russian case, but during the First World War, right, German, Imperial Germany, Imperial Russia are at war with each other. Imperial Russian armies captured German soldiers. Those German soldiers were sent to camps in Russia, and they were deployed to a series of tasks in captivity, right? Were they farming? Were they working in factories, and so on and so forth? During the First World War, this is all supposed to be administered under the terms and conditions of the Hague Convention. And it does apply. In the interwar years, then, there is a movement towards the creation of the First Geneva Convention. For a variety of reasons, the Soviet Union does not sign it. And for the sake of the Second World War, they create their own provision on the treatment of prisoners of war. And it's largely actually modeled on the terms and conditions of the Geneva Convention for POWs. There are just certain slight changes that the Soviets make. So for the Geneva Convention, you were allowed to segregate soldiers based on race. The Soviet Union says, we're not going to do that. Everyone's just going to be interned together. So largely the Soviets, at least on paper, their directives and stipulations say you have to feed and clothe the prisoners adequately. Each prisoner is supposed to be given the same rations as the equivalent rank in the capturing nation's army, right? So if a private or the equivalent of a private in the Red Army gets X number of grams of food and bread and potatoes and what have you, then an equivalent of a private from the German army is supposed to get the same in captivity. The Geneva Conventions and experience from the First World War, they also say that prisoners can be used for labor. Geneva and Hague, though, stipulate what types of industries they can work in, how close or how far away from the battle lines they can work, and so on and so forth. The Soviets don't quite follow that. So, for example, captured prisoners are not supposed to be used in war industries. The Soviets did use captured Germans to contribute towards war industries, production of shells, for example, or munitions, and so on and so forth. So this is not a unique context. This is not unique in terms of the Second World War. As you mentioned, that there were camps in Rhodesia that held Germans. The British, the French, the Americans, they all had camps for German prisoners of war as well. In fact, during the initial campaigns in North Africa, there was not necessarily a great camp structure there. So there were a lot of German prisoners who were captured in North Africa who were sent to the United States and kept in prisoner of war camps all throughout the US. So not unique. The United States returned a lot of their prisoners pretty soon after the end of the Second World War. Some of them actually went to England first to participate in post-war reconstruction in England before they were returned to Germany. All the Allies agreed at the end of the war that the prisoners should be returned, actual prisoners, right? I'm not including war criminals and things like that. But if you're just a standard prisoner of war, the Allies all said by December 31st, 1948, we'll return ours, right? So the US returns theirs on time, the British return theirs on time, they return all of their Germans by 46, 47. The French have to be strong-armed by the British and the Americans to return their prisoners by December 31st, 1948, but they comply. The Soviets do not. And then in 1949, the beginning of the year, the Soviets release a press release and they say, we do not have any more prisoners of war. We have war criminals. So they enact a linguistic shift. Whether or not these men were actually war criminals, it seems like they were just changed nominally so that it would be considered okay. And the other allies don't really agree with this, and they use this for their own motives and arguments in the Cold War as well. So, for example, when conflict breaks out in Korea as part of the Cold War, the Western allies and the Soviets try to attack each other in the press or even in front of the United Nations concerning the prisoners of war still related to the Second World War. And they bring it into the conversations of Koreans and American prisoners of war and treatment and captivity of them.
Well, that's
So
interesting.
it's a
Yeah.
lot more than just the story of the Second World
Sure.
War. It connects to the First World War. It
Yes.
connects to the active conflicts of the Cold War.
Yes, yes, and thank you very much for that particular context. It explains quite a lot about the project. Um, if you can be brief about this, as we move with our discussion, what do you think is the major contribution of this manuscript, of this particular work, to the conventional discourse that already exists on World War II studies, on military history? What's the contribution?
I think my major contributions are connecting the story of wartime prisoner captivity in the Soviet Union to the broader context of the forced labor prison system in the Soviet Union and showing how they are really related to economics. It's not necessarily that it was economically the best idea, right? Free labor tends to work better than forced prison labor. I'm not trying to make a conversation there. I'm just trying to say that there were economic concerns involved. Certainly, there is punishment involved as well. If you capture somebody and hold him for 11 or more years and force him to rebuild what he destroyed, that is a form of punishment. But at least in the earlier years, the primary motivating force behind Soviet authorities for incarceration was related to economics and the material conditions in the Soviet Union caused by the Second World War.
Interesting. Were there laws that governed how, prisoners of wars and refugees are managed or kept in a foreign country that might be universal or something?
With the Soviet Union, there are directives that come from above, and then
Mhm.
what actually happens on the ground is not necessarily always in line with the
That's true.
directives.
That's true. That's true.
And there are also a
That's
lot of
true.
different case-by-case things, right? So there are
Uh-huh.
camps, the ways that we would think of a camp with,
Uh-huh.
there's a wall, there are guards, and so on and so forth. There are
Yes.
barracks there. And then other prisoners, based on how the labor needs were, they would
Mm-hmm.
be loaned out to local industries. So I
Mm-hmm.
have contracts between camps and factories, and
Mm-hmm.
terms of the contract say you have to build a barrack, and the prisoners are going to live in housing at the factory. At the
Mm-hmm.
factory, you are responsible for feeding and clothing the prisoner. When the term of
Mm-hmm.
this contract is done, the prisoner comes back to the camp for redeployment elsewhere.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So now I want you to take me through the major findings of your book and what we can maybe consider to be the major lessons that we can draw from those findings.
Yeah, I mean, as I've been sort of stating before, it's related to economics, not purely punishment. That this also is not isolated, right? The Soviet context of German captivity is not unique. America, Britain, and France used their Germans for labor needs during and after the war as well, just in smaller scale and different deployments and situations. Um, so this is a story, obviously, the Eastern Front conditioned by the conditions of the Eastern Front, but it is also part of a broader context of prisoner of war captivity and labor from the First World War and Second World War. And this is also a broader story of the connections, at least in Europe, between Germany, both what become both Germany's and the Soviet Union and the Cold War
Yes. Wow.
because these men are, what becomes West Germany, what becomes East Germany, they want their German citizens back. They want their
Mhm.
sons, husbands, fathers, what have you. And this ends up conditioning politics between the two Germanys,
Mhm.
even East Germany, right? They're supposed to be an ally of the Soviet Union. Publicly, they can't say so much in their newspapers. Their politicians can't say too much. They have to mirror whatever the party line is of the Soviet Union regarding the prisoners of war. But behind closed doors, and I looked at some records on the German side for this, the East German officials are writing to the Soviet officials and saying, hey, where are the men?
Yes.
Send them back. You should
Yes.
send them back. The
Mhm.
women are very upset. There's unrest at home. We want these men back.
Mhm. Mhm. Wow. Wow. Interest. What explanation was given to keep? I understand you said they were repatriated in phases.
Mhm.
And the ones that were released first are those that they did not need and they kept the able-bodied ones. So what explanation was given for keeping people, as opposed to just repatriating them all at once?
Yeah, publicly they're not giving necessarily reasons, right?
Hmm.
So the major phases after 1945, right? War is over. Anybody ill or injured, they start going home. As soon as the war
Hmm.
is over, ill or injured are sent home because the Soviet Union does not have the resources to care for these men. They don't have the
Hmm.
resources to care for their own free citizens,
Oh,
right?
yes,
There's
yes.
still lots of rationing, there's still lots of hunger. And so it's easier for Soviet officials to send back they only have so many resources. So
Hmm.
they want to distribute the resources to the people who can contribute.
Yes, yes.
In 1946 and 1947, it's not very well known. There's a famine in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
So again, Soviet citizens are suffering immensely. There's not enough food to feed free, regular Soviet citizens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everything is done on a centralized system of production and distribution in the Soviet Union. So when there are scarce resources, right, the free citizen who works in the steel mill, who works that heavy shift there, he's going to be fed the most food.
Mm-hmm.
Women
Mm-hmm.
and children who don't work in the factory, the elderly who aren't contributing to physical labor, they are fed a smaller ration.
Mm-hmm.
Prison populations, again, in theory, are fed smaller rations
Mm-hmm.
because of the way the hierarchy works. So when there's a famine, again, there are famine conditions. Soviet authorities increase repatriations from the camps so that there are fewer men, so that the scarce amount of food that they have can be better allocated, in theory, to the
Mm-hmm.
men in the camps. This is how
Mm-hmm.
the Soviets try to do this. 1949, we have the shift. They are now suddenly branded as war criminals. Whether or not they're all actually convicted war criminals is not the case. There were many legitimate war criminals held in the Soviet Union, right? There were mass atrocities, but a large number of men who are then branded as war criminals are not. Those ones then, who are released between 1949 and 1956, are released either due to the concerns of the Soviet Union's domestic politics or international politics vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the Germanys. So 49, West Germany and East Germany officially become states. Certain numbers of specially trained anti-fascist German prisoners, they went through re-education programs. They're sent back to all four, well, what were the four occupation sectors, what becomes West Germany, what becomes East Germany, to undertake propaganda and agitation roles. 1953, Stalin dies. A handful of Germans are released. 1953, there's also a major workers' uprising and chaos that starts in Berlin, spreads across all of East Germany. A handful of German prisoners are returned as a goodwill gesture to to build confidence in the East German regime. Do not give up on them. Look, they got your sons and fathers back. And then in 1956, the last of the prisoners are released, more so because Khrushchev wants to improve relations with West Germany after West Germany just joined NATO. This scares him. He wants to make overtures. He wants to normalize relations with West Germany, hoping to pull them out a little bit from the sway and influence of the Western powers and NATO. And so, as an ultimate consideration, Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, he goes over to the Soviet Union, and Adenauer says, nothing's going to happen unless you release the final prisoners of war. And Khrushchev relents after numerous days of tense negotiations and says, fine, I'll release the last of the Germans. It is more important to me to have full diplomatic relations with West Germany. So there are political considerations happening as well.
Wow, that's very interesting. My very last question for you, what's the target audience of this book? And, who would greatly benefit if they are to get their hands on the book?
I would like to say that there are a lot of different audiences who could
Mhm.
get benefit from this book. Obviously, people who are interested in the history of the Eastern Front and World War II,
Mhm.
people who are interested in Soviet-German relations in the early Cold War, people who are interested in digital humanities and how
Yes.
you can combine digital humanities methods, research and publishing with traditional historical research methods.
Yes.
People who are just interested in the history of forced labor or prison camp systems, right? Because this is a nice comparative example to a
Mhm.
system that has worldwide use.
Yes. Yes. Wow, that's excellent. I'm very excited to have heard you, Dr. Susan, on this particular platform. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would want to get a copy of Dr. Susan's book, you can click the link that is right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Dr. Susan, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much.
That's nice.